So I want to talk about one more concept that is linked with some of the stuff we've talked about. This is not strictly the same thing as missing premises or implied premises, but I think since we've talked about this idea of premises being, or statements more generally being more or less controversial, it's a good time to bring up this idea of the burden of proof. Because, the Lavin section I had you guys read on this, Lavin brings up more or less controversial in the context of burden of proof. And I think it's a really important concept that we should talk about. It's not a hugely complex thing. I think most people can get this pretty well, but it's really important. And it's really important because I'm trying to think of a polite way to put this. It's really important because seeing what the burden of proof is will help you to call some nonsense reasoning. It's a good way of diagnosing what's wrong with some really, really bad reasoning that people engage in. Okay, so what's the burden of proof? The person with the burden of proof is the person who must make their case in an argument. If you have the burden of proof, you are the one who has to show that what you're saying is true. If you can't do that, then in a sense, the other person wins, right? And we can also speak about how high the burden of proof is or how demanding the burden of proof is. And when we talk about that, we're like, how good the case has to be, right? Let me give you guys an example that might make this clear, I hope. Let's think about the US legal system. I watch too many TV shows about crime, but whatever, right? So ask yourself, who has the burden of proof in a criminal trial in the US? Who, if you are in a criminal trial in the US, who has the burden of proof? This is actually not just a matter of convention, this is a matter of law. Who is it? Now, think about what is that burden of proof. If you've ever watched legal dramas, you can probably roll off the lines. Think about it. Who has the burden of proof in a criminal trial in the US? The prosecution. What is that burden of proof? Beyond a reasonable doubt. And if you guys remember nothing else from this class, this might not be a bad thing to remember, right? Because I'll see this, my poor old dad, I used to argue with him about this. We'd watch these awful Discovery Channel like crime dramas sometimes when I was home. And we'd get in an argument. My dad would be like, "What? I think they should hang that guy." And I'm like, "Well, don't you?" And he'd be like, "Don't you think the jury should convict?" And I'm like, I don't know. I don't think I would on the jury. And he's like, "Well, do you think he's innocent?" And I'm like, "Well, no, I don't know that he's innocent." And he'd be like, "Well, don't you think he's guilty?" In a lot of these cases, I'd be like, "Yeah, with the evidence I've got in front of me, I'd peg the odds at 60% he's guilty, right?" But look, take these two statements, right? If it's just like, "Well, do you think he's innocent?" And I'm like, "Well, I'm not sure." If it were just 50-50, then of course you should vote to acquit if you're on a jury, because 50-50 means that neither side has proved anything. Well, the prosecution has the burden of proof, right? The defense doesn't need to show you that the person is innocent. The prosecution needs to show you they are guilty. And not just that, even if the prosecution made a pretty good case, even if they made a case where I'm like, okay, 60% this guy did it, they haven't met the burden of proof, right? Because the burden of proof is very high, very demanding in a criminal case. What is that burden of proof? Beyond a reasonable doubt. And I don't know what the number for that would be, but for me, it surely wouldn't be 60%, right? 3 out of 5, a little better than half. That's not good enough for me for reasonable doubt, right? I don't think it should be for you either. If you're on a jury, you might put the number lower than I do. Prosecutors apparently hate philosophy professors because we're bad at setting the burden of proof very high. If I were sending somebody to jail, I probably would want it to be at least 95%. maybe more like 99, right? Burden of proof might not be that high. You might set a lower number, but it's going to be pretty high. Well, that's the legal system. I think that's a good example. Now, more generally, in some cases, in a lot of academic fields, they will tell you what the burden of proof is, right? If you're taking a math class, you need to give a mathematical proof for accepting a lot of claims, right? If you're taking a philosophy class, it might be more vague, but if I'm having you write something and you need to give evidence for controversial claims, right? In the, out in the real world, the rules aren't as precise, but generally speaking, the person making the more controversial claim has the burden of proof. If you say Elvis is alive and living in Vegas, fighting crime with Bat Boy, this was something like this crazy tabloid, the Weekly World News, used to say, you have a higher proof than I do if I say, well, I'm pretty sure Elvis is dead. Right? Way more controversial to say Elvis is alive, living with Bat Boy, fighting crime, than it is to just say, yeah, he's probably dead. Incidentally, there was a kind of sleazy country music producer, manager, who had a guy who could sing like Elvis, who promoted this rumor that Elvis had faked his own death and that his guy who could sing like Elvis was Elvis. For a while, he had this guy wear a mask. Then he had a bunch of plastic surgery, so he looked kind of sort of like Elvis. But as far as I can tell, that's where that rumor got started. Anyway, basic idea, more controversial the claim is, the higher the burden of proof is. Now, it's important to keep this in mind, right? If you're on a jury, if you ever get called for a jury, especially a criminal jury, you need to keep this in mind, because if you don't, you might send somebody to prison who shouldn't go to prison, right? That's really important. But it's important, I think, in life, just more generally, because there's an error that a lot of people commit, a fallacy called burden of proof shifting. A fallacy is a bad form of reasoning, a tricky form of reasoning that looks like it's good, that's not. And burden of proof shifting is a very common fallacy. And what it involves is the person with the burden of proof tries to shift it to the other person. And they often set it arbitrarily high. Let me give you guys a few toy cases, right? Let's imagine this little dialogue. Jimmy says Nessie is real. There are photos of her after all. And Claire says, well, the kids who took those original photos admitted it was a hoax, and none of the other photos are very good. And Jimmy falls back to, well, that doesn't prove she doesn't exist. Show me that it's impossible, right? Jimmy has the burden of proof here, right? Jimmy is claiming that somehow a dinosaur survived the event that wiped out all the other dinosaurs and lives in a Scottish lake. That is a way more controversial claim than, well, actually, no, all the dinosaurs died and there's not this random one survivor who lives in a Scottish lake, right? But what he's doing, he's trying to shift the burden of proof to Claire, prove to me she doesn't exist, and he's setting that really high, right? If she said, well, the lake's really small, nobody's detected it, so on and so forth, Jimmy would almost certainly say, well, she could exist, right? Maybe she's just hard to detect. Burden of proof shifting. Let me give you guys another example. Roy says the earth is flat. You can't see the curve from a plane after all, and the ground sure seems flat. Molly says, well, the curve is visible from planes that fly really high. I forget how high you have to fly, but I think once you get up, I think planes are 35,000 feet or something like that. Once you get up much higher, you can start to see the curve of the earth, they say. I mean, I've never seen it, but, I'm told you can. NASA has pictures of the earth that show it to be round, right? And Roy says, all those pictures could be faked. You haven't proven the earth is round. Well, he's doing two things here, right? a matter of scientific fact that you get told in, I think, the first or second grade. Disputing that is more controversial than saying, yeah, every single science teacher I've ever talked to is right, the earth is round. He's also shifting the proof to make it arbitrarily high, right? Prove to me it's impossible. You haven't proven it's impossible. Those photos could be faked. If we put Jimmy in like one of those, or sorry, Roy here, I called this guy Roy, I can call them both Jimmy, but if you put Roy here in one of those planes that flies super high that NASA and the Air Force have, and he saw the curve of the earth, he'd probably be like, oh, this is an elaborate hoax too. I don't know how you're doing it, but you're just projecting it, right? He will keep shifting the burden of proof. Nothing would ever convince him. Now look, if you think Nessie is real or the Loch Ness or Bigfoot or whatever, I don't care, right? If I'm making you less happy saying they're not real, I am sorry. It's a harmless belief. But people try to support some really harmful beliefs by shifting the burden of proof, right? I had the misfortune to meet this idiot once. He was a friend of mine's boyfriend. Luckily, she dumped this guy. But this guy was like a Holocaust denier, right? And he's like, he said, well, prove to me the Holocaust happened. And it's like, well, I don't know that I need to prove to you basic matters of historical fact, but, there's a lot of pictures of death camps. There's a lot of people who say they were there. And, this jackass would be like, well, they could be lying. Those photos could be faked, right? So I picked some kind of cute examples, but you will see people defending some truly, truly noxious things, just awful things by shifting the burden of proof. And, if you have the misfortune to run into one of these people, you're probably not going to convince them, right? Whatever was wrong with this guy and whatever is wrong with people who deny the Holocaust, you're not going to fix by diagnosing where their argument is garbage. But you should be able to spot it, and don't for a second doubt that you are right and they are wrong just because you can't prove something when you don't have the burden of proof or meet this arbitrarily high standard of burden of proof that they have. Now, look, in the real world, there are cases where who has the burden of proof is unclear, but when someone is telling you something outrageous and crazy, like the earth is not round or the Holocaust didn't happen, then they definitely have the burden of proof, and it is incredibly high. So high that, of course, they won't be able to meet it because the earth is round and the Holocaust did happen. But, this is the main mistake they are throwing out. You should catch it and call nonsense. All right, we'll practice a little bit with burden of proof in class. It's only tangentially related to this stuff on missing premises, but I think it is good to say a little bit about it now since Lavin does discuss it.